Fat pig. That's what my own daughter Olivia screamed at me in front of 200 wedding guests, pointing her manicured finger as laughter exploded across the ballroom. My face burned with shame. My hands trembled around the small gift I had wrapped with so much care. In that moment, I wanted the earth to swallow me whole. But then, the laughter stopped. Richard Sterling, Olivia's new father-in-law, a man in an immaculate tuxedo and commanding presence, froze mid-chuckle. His eyes locked on mine, his expression shifting from cruel amusement to something I hadn't seen in decades. Recognition. The room fell silent as he whispered, "Wait, aren't you the woman who just bought Sterling Industries?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. My daughter's cruel smile faltered, and in that single instant, the narrative changed. Because the woman she had mocked, humiliated, and discarded as worthless, was the very person who held her new family's financial future in the palm of her hand. I am Eleanor Hayes, invisible for decades. Mocked, ridiculed, dismissed, but also the silent millionaire who built an empire while the world laughed at me. And tonight, my secret was finally out. The Sterling Metropolitan Ballroom was drenched in glittering light. Crystal chandeliers dripped down from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. Champagne flutes sparkled on tables dressed in ivory silk, and the entire space smelled faintly of roses and expensive perfume. It was, by every measure, the kind of night where appearances meant everything, and Eleanor Hayes, was the last person anyone expected to walk through those doors. I wasn't dressed in designer silk or diamonds. My wine-colored dress had cost $30 at a thrift shop, and though I had pressed it carefully that afternoon, the fabric still looked tired compared to the shimmering gowns that surrounded me. My shoes, black leather with a modest heel, were scuffed at the edges. In my hands, I clutched a small box wrapped in simple gold paper and tied with a ribbon I had ironed flat. It was my daughter's wedding day, and somehow, despite every unspoken warning, despite the silent judgment I knew I would face, I came. Olivia Hayes, my only child, my pride once upon a time, was marrying Daniel Sterling, the heir to one of the most prestigious families in Charlotte. The Sterlings were old money. Their name carried weight. Their company logo, Sterling Industries, was engraved on skyscrapers, embroidered on foundations, whispered in boardrooms. And tonight, their son's wedding was the social event of the year. 200 of the city's most powerful people filled the ballroom. Mayors, lawyers, CEOs, men in sharp tuxedos and women dripping in jewels. And me. I slipped in quietly, my head lowered, hoping, foolishly, that Olivia would allow me to exist in her orbit for one night without shame. That she would remember, just for a moment, that I was her mother. But the moment her eyes caught me from across the dance floor, I knew hope had been wasted. Her lips twisted into a smirk. Her perfectly curled hair bounced as she turned toward her bridesmaids, whispering. Laughter bubbled among them, sharp and cruel. I took a deep breath and reminded myself, "You've survived worse than this, Eleanor. You've survived years of silence, years of invisibility. You can survive a little laughter." I tried to move toward an empty table in the back, tried to disappear into the shadows. But Olivia wasn't going to let me. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice, magnified by the microphone, rang across the ballroom. The quartet fell silent. Every head turned toward the glowing bride in her ivory gown, her diamonds catching the light, and then she pointed at me. "Do you all see that?" She said, her voice shrill with triumph. "That's my mother. Or should I say, the fat pig who thinks she belongs here?" The laughter was instant, explosive. A wave of cruel amusement rippled through the crowd. Men chuckled behind raised glasses. Women covered their mouths with manicured hands, whispering into each other's ears. Even the waiters smirked as they passed with trays of caviar. Heat rose in my cheeks so fast I thought I might faint. My hands shook violently around the gift box. My throat closed. My breath came shallow. My body screamed at me to run, but my feet stayed planted. I was frozen. Humiliation washed over me like fire, scorching, unrelenting. I could hear the words echoing in my head. Fat pig, fat pig, fat pig. Someone snickered behind me. Another guest muttered, "Who let her in?" And then I saw it. The flash of a phone camera. Someone was recording. My humiliation, immortalized in pixels for strangers to laugh at later. It wasn't just Olivia's words that cut me. It was the way the entire room agreed. 200 strangers looked at me as if I were an animal that had wandered into the most elegant event of the year. My chest ached. For a moment, I thought I might collapse right there among the roses and champagne. And then, something strange happened. The laughter faltered. Not everywhere, just in one corner. Richard Sterling, Daniel's father, stood near the stage. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a bespoke tuxedo, his hair silver at the temples, his presence commanding. He had been laughing with the others just moments before, his booming chuckle rising above the crowd. But now he wasn't laughing. His glass trembled in his hand. His eyes, sharp and calculating, were locked on me. I shifted uncomfortably under his stare. Why was he looking at me like that? "Wait," Richard murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. His voice was quiet, but in the sudden hush it carried. He stepped forward, his expression tightening, confusion, and something else, fear, recognition, flashing across his face. He took another step toward me, ignoring the whispers, ignoring the guests who still smirked. His gaze never left mine. "Wait a minute," he said again, louder this time. His tone was no longer mocking but urgent. His eyes narrowed as if he were solving a puzzle that had suddenly fallen into place. "Are you—" He hesitated, swallowing hard. "Are you my new boss?" The ballroom froze. The words hung in the air like thunder. Whispers exploded around me. "Boss? What does he mean?" Heads turned. Guests leaned in. Phones lowered. Even the waiters stopped mid-step. Olivia blinked, confused, her smirk faltering. "What are you talking about, Mr. Sterling?" she asked, her laugh suddenly forced, nervous. "That's my mother. You know, the cleaning lady I told you about." But Richard Sterling didn't laugh. His face had drained of color. He was staring at me as if he had just seen a ghost. And in that moment, in that piercing silence, I realized what was happening. The secret I had carried for decades, the empire I had built in shadows, the alias I had guarded, the silence of the ballroom lingered in my chest long after I stepped outside. Cold air hit my skin like knives as I moved down the marble steps, clutching the little gold box in my trembling hands. Charlotte's night skyline stretched above me, towering buildings, their glass windows glowing against the dark sky. For a brief moment, I almost let the tears fall. But I didn't. I couldn't. I had learned long ago. Pain was private. As I walked toward the quiet street, my mind slipped backward, tugged into the shadows of memory. The years no one in that glittering ballroom cared to know about. My husband, James Hayes, died on a rainy October morning. A drunk driver, an unlit intersection, and in a matter of seconds, my life became a before and after story. Olivia was 10 years old. She had her father's eyes, her father's stubborn chin. The funeral blurred by in flowers and condolences. But what I remember most is the way she clung to me, whispering, "Who's going to take care of us now, Mom?" I promised her we would be fine. But promises don't pay rent, so I found work, any work. By day, I answered phones for a small law firm. By night, I cleaned offices. I scrubbed toilets, vacuumed conference rooms, emptied trash cans while executives left behind lipstick-stained glasses and expensive cigars. Olivia hated it. One night she burst out, "Why can't you be like other moms? Why do you have to smell like bleach?" Her words cut deep, but I stayed silent. She was a child. She didn't understand that survival has its own scent. The law firm's office smelled of paper and ink. While others went home, I lingered after hours, wiping down mahogany desks. But as I polished brass nameplates and dusted bookshelves, I started to notice things. Discarded copies of the Wall Street Journal. Legal briefs tossed into recycling bins. Annual reports left half open on desks. At first, I glanced at them out of curiosity. Numbers, charts, phrases like net operating income and asset allocation that meant nothing to me. But the more I looked, the more the words began to form patterns. I started borrowing library books. Accounting for Beginners, Investing 101. Slowly, painfully, I taught myself. I learned to read balance sheets the way others read novels. Profit margins told me stories. Cash flows whispered secrets. The janitor was becoming a student. And eventually, the student became something more. In 2001, I used $500 of saved wages to buy my first stock, a crumbling textile company that everyone else had written off. I had overheard partners at the law firm dismiss it as dead weight, but I had read the reports closely, too closely. I knew they had liquid assets others overlooked. I bought 20 shares. 2 years later, they tripled in value. I remember staring at the numbers on the screen, heart pounding, tears streaming down my face. For the first time since James died, I felt like I had power again. By 2005, I had built enough to incorporate under an alias, E.J. Bowman. The name meant nothing, but behind it was me, an invisible woman no one respected, quietly pulling levers no one could see. I bought into small companies, local bakeries, auto shops, mom-and-pop stores on the edge of collapse. I didn't just invest. I showed up at night with spreadsheets, reorganizing their books, teaching them what I'd taught myself. In return, I asked for equity. Some thought I was crazy, some thought I was desperate. But the businesses survived, and slowly my stake grew. And with every success, so did the secret. But secrecy has a price. Olivia grew. She became a teenager, then a college student. She begged for designer clothes, for a car, for the things her friends had. I could have given her all of it, but I didn't. Instead, I let her believe we were barely making ends meet. I let her resent me. I let her despise the thrift store dresses, the secondhand shoes, because I needed to know if one day she stood to inherit everything, would she be grateful or greedy? Would she value dignity over diamonds? The answer broke my heart. By her 20s, Olivia had all but disowned me socially. She told friends I was a cleaner, a nobody. She begged me not to show up at her sorority events. And by the time Daniel Sterling entered her life, she introduced me not as her mother, but as someone I grew up with. The cold wind snapped me back to the street outside the ballroom. I tightened my grip on the gold box. Inside were a pair of pearl earrings, modest but beautiful. James had once promised he'd give them to Olivia when she got married. He never got the chance, so I had saved for years. Quietly, patiently, to make good on his promise, and tonight, when I finally tried to hand them to her, she had called me a fat pig. I closed my eyes, breathing through the ache in my chest. But then, Richard Sterling's face flashed in my mind, the shock, the recognition. He knew me. Not as Eleanor Hayes, invisible widow, but as E.J. Bowman, the silent investor who had wired $80 million to save his company from bankruptcy just months ago. And if Richard recognized me, others would soon follow. The life I had spent decades building in shadows was about to collide with the life I had lived in humiliation, and my daughter, whether she liked it or not, was standing at the very center of it. With my life, was no longer safe. Because Richard Sterling had recognized me, and recognition changes everything. The night after the wedding should have been filled with toasts, champagne, and whispered congratulations. Instead, the ballroom was buzzing with something far more electric: confusion. Guests huddled in corners, whispering not about the flowers or the cake, but about the strange tension they had witnessed. They replayed it like a scandalous reel, the bride calling her own mother a pig, the sudden silence, the odd look that crossed Richard Sterling's face. No one could quite explain it, but everyone had felt it. By the time the last bottle of champagne was drained, speculation was already spilling beyond the walls of the hotel. Socialites texted each other with phrases like, "Did you see the way he froze?" And "Who was that woman really?" The next morning, Charlotte's elite had a new topic of gossip. Olivia slammed the bedroom door so hard the chandelier rattled. still in her silk nightgown, her mascara smudged from last night's tears. She paced the Sterling Estates master suite like a caged animal. "I can't believe her," she spat, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Showing up like that. Embarrassing me. Do you have any idea what people are saying, Daniel? That I humiliated her for no reason. That I'm cruel. That she's—" She stopped herself, her face twisting. "That she's someone important." Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, untying his cufflinks with steady fingers. His eyes, tired but thoughtful, stayed on his wife. "Olivia," he said softly. "She's your mother." "She's nothing," Olivia snapped, her voice cracking. "She's a cleaning woman who doesn't know her place. And now, thanks to whatever weird look your father gave her, everyone's whispering like she's—" She trailed off, then hissed, "Like she's above me." Her chest rose and fell as she glared at Daniel. "Find out what she's hiding." Across town, Eleanor sat in her modest one-bedroom apartment. The thrift store dress hung neatly in her closet again, pressed as if nothing had happened. The pearl earrings still lay in their gold-wrapped box on her kitchen counter. She sipped plain tea, her hands steady. Outwardly, she looked calm. But inside, her thoughts churned. The way Richard Sterling's eyes had lingered on her haunted her. Did he know? Or did he just suspect? It didn't matter. Either way, the walls of her secret life were cracking. At the Sterling estate, Richard couldn't sleep. He sat in his oak-paneled study, the fire flickering low. A glass of whiskey sweated on his desk. He replayed the moment in his head. The thrift store dress, the tired shoes, the eyes he recognized but couldn't place at first. He had seen her signature before. E.J. Bowman, the elusive investor who had wired millions to rescue Sterling Industries. But no, that couldn't be the same woman who had been humiliated in his ballroom. Could it? His jaw clenched. He needed answers. But he also knew, if he voiced his suspicion too loudly, it could unravel everything. For now, he kept silent. Within days, whispers turned into rumors. At charity luncheons and country clubs, women leaned in close and asked, "Did you hear about the wedding? I heard the bride's mother is not who she seems." Richard Sterling nearly bowed to her. Imagine. Some dismissed it as nonsense. Others, hungrier for scandal, fanned the flames. Olivia read every word, her anger growing with each whisper she overheard. She slammed her phone onto the vanity one afternoon, glaring at her reflection. "They're laughing at me," she muttered. "At me." One evening, Daniel drove quietly to Eleanor's apartment. He had no plan, no clear reason, just a gnawing guilt that wouldn't leave him. She opened the door, surprised but not unkind. "Daniel," she said softly. "You shouldn't be here." He stepped inside, eyes scanning the humble space. No diamonds, no luxury, just a small bookshelf lined with worn finance manuals, a faded sofa, a kitchen table polished clean. "I wanted to apologize," he said. For what Olivia said? For what happened at the wedding? Eleanor poured him tea. It's not the first time she said something like that. Daniel winced. She's complicated. But she's also under pressure. My family... He stopped, searching for the right words. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Then, with a small, sad smile, she said, "Your family will teach her pride. I was hoping I could teach her humility. Clearly, I failed." Daniel looked at the finance books on the shelf, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "You read all of these?" Eleanor nodded, sipping her tea. Every word. There was a depth in her gaze that unsettled him. This wasn't a woman to dismiss as a nobody. He sensed it, even if he couldn't explain it. When Daniel returned, Olivia pounced. "Well, what did you see?" "Just a modest apartment," he said carefully. "Books, tea, nothing strange." Olivia narrowed her eyes. "You're lying. I know she's hiding something." From that day on, Olivia's obsession grew. She began snooping, checking public records, even sneaking into Eleanor's apartment when she thought she wasn't home. Every empty bank slip, every neatly folded receipt, every finance book became a piece of a puzzle she couldn't solve. Her anger only grew. In the mansion's dining room one evening, Olivia cornered her father-in-law. "Dad," she said sharply, "you know something about her, don't you?" Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't answer, and in the silence between them, Olivia's suspicion hardened into certainty. Her mother was more than she seemed, and Olivia would stop at nothing to uncover it. Olivia could not sleep that night. The whisper of her father-in-law's silence gnawed at her like a splinter buried too deep to pull out. She tossed and turned in the silk sheets of the Sterling mansion, her mind circling the same image again and again, her mother standing in that cheap maroon dress, clutching a tiny box while an entire ballroom laughed. Except Richard Sterling hadn't laughed. He had looked at her mother as if she were someone, and that Olivia couldn't forgive. She rose from bed in the early hours, slipping a silk robe over her shoulders. Daniel stirred but did not wake as she padded across the room, her bare feet silent on the carpet. She sat at the vanity staring at her reflection. The woman who looked back was beautiful. Yes, her makeup perfect, her hair like spun gold. But beneath it all, she saw a flicker of something she despised: doubt. What if her mother had secrets? What if the woman she had mocked wasn't the powerless nobody she had convinced herself she was? No, impossible. Eleanor Hayes was a failure, a cleaner, a shadow. Nothing more. And yet, why had Richard looked at her that way? By morning, Olivia's obsession had hardened into determination. She would find out the truth. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat quietly at her kitchen table, the morning sun streaming through the thin curtains. She folded the newspaper neatly, her tea cooling beside her, and let her mind wander. It wasn't the insults that haunted her, they had long ago lost their sting, but the silence that followed. Richard Sterling's silence. She had built her life around secrets, but secrets had a way of leaking through the cracks. Her phone buzzed. A message from Olivia. "We need to talk. Tonight." Eleanor stared at the screen for a long time before setting it face down on the table. When Olivia arrived that evening, she did not bother knocking. She swept into the apartment as though she owned it, her heels clicking against the worn floorboards. Her nose wrinkled at the sight of the faded sofa, the thrift store curtains, the stack of finance books by the wall. "God, this place is depressing," she muttered. "I don't know how you live like this." Eleanor, sitting in her chair with a calmness carved from years of storms, merely raised an eyebrow. "Hello to you too, Olivia." Her daughter turned, eyes flashing. "Cut the act." "Who are you?" Eleanor tilted her head. "I'm your mother." "No," Olivia snapped. "Don't play games with me. People are talking. Dad, Richard, looked at you like he knew you. And Daniel said your apartment is full of books, financial books. What's going on?" Eleanor let the silence stretch until Olivia's impatience filled the room like static. Then she rose slowly, moved to a small drawer by the kitchen counter, and pulled out a manila envelope. She placed it on the table with deliberate care. "What's this?" Olivia demanded. "A choice," Eleanor said. Olivia tore it open. Inside was a crisp contract, neatly typed. Her eyes scanned the words, her brow furrowing. It offered money, an enormous sum, far more than Olivia had ever imagined her mother could possess. But there were conditions. Relentless, humiliating conditions. A month of living on minimum wage, volunteering every weekend in a soup kitchen, attending weekly dinners with Eleanor, no phones, no excuses. And at the end of it all, a public apology. Not just to Eleanor, but to the waitstaff she had mocked at her wedding. Olivia's lips curled. "This is insane. You think I'm going to humiliate myself like that? For what, for a check?" Eleanor's eyes, cool and steady, never wavered. "For the truth." Olivia slammed the contract down. "You're not rich. You're bluffing. If you had this kind of money, I'd have known. You're just trying to control me. Like always." At that moment, Daniel entered, called by Olivia's raised voice. He picked up the contract, his brows knitting as he read. "This isn't about control," he said quietly. "This is about respect. She's asking us to prove we care more about dignity than money." Olivia whirled on him. Don't you dare take her side. But Daniel didn't answer. He just looked at Eleanor with something Olivia couldn't recognize: respect. The room thickened with tension, the air heavy with unspoken truths. Eleanor stood, gathered the envelope, and slipped it back into the drawer. "You're not ready," she said simply. Olivia's face burned. "I will find out what you're hiding," she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "And when I do, don't expect me to forgive you." Eleanor watched her storm out, her heels pounding against the hallway floor. When the door closed, silence settled again. Daniel lingered for a moment, his eyes on Eleanor. "Why didn't you just tell her?" he asked softly. Eleanor's gaze dropped to the little gold box still sitting on the counter. She ran her fingers over the ribbon, her expression unreadable. "Because truth," she said, her voice low, "isn't a gift you hand to someone who hasn't learned how to hold it." Daniel's breath caught, but he said nothing. He nodded once, then followed his wife into the night, leaving Eleanor alone with her secrets. But not for much longer. Olivia's obsession became a shadow that followed her every step. Even in the glittering halls of the Sterling mansion, where crystal chandeliers and Persian rugs whispered of wealth and power, she felt hunted by whispers. Everywhere she went, luncheons, charity meetings, dinners, people looked at her differently. Their smiles lingered too long, their voices dipped just slightly when they mentioned her mother. "Your mother seemed unusual. Strange how your father-in-law reacted, wasn't it? You must be proud of her, after all she's done." The words twisted inside Olivia like knives. She laughed them off, of course, flipping her hair and changing the subject, but the bitterness burned in her throat. She had spent years crafting an image of perfection, climbing into the Sterling family's world, only for Eleanor in her second-hand dress, to unravel it with a single look. Late at night, when Daniel was asleep, Olivia sat with her laptop glowing in the dark. She typed her mother's name into search engines, scrolling for hours, desperate to find some hidden record. But all she found were fragments: property tax bills for the small apartment, a decades-old obituary for James Hayes, nothing else. Nothing that explained why Richard Sterling had looked at her mother with something close to fear. One night, she grew so desperate she slipped out of bed and drove across town to her mother's apartment. She parked across the street, her breath fogging the windshield, watching the yellow light glow from behind the curtains. After half an hour, when Eleanor's light finally went out, Olivia climbed from her car and crept across the street. The lock was old. She had lived there once as a child. The key still fit. She slipped inside. The apartment smelled of lemon cleaner and old paper. Her heels clicked against the linoleum as she moved carefully, her eyes darting around the familiar but alien space. She opened drawers, checked the fridge, searched through piles of mail. Nothing. Nothing but utility bills and neatly folded receipts. Then her gaze fell on the bookshelf. Dozens of volumes lined the shelves. Finance, economics, biographies of industrial titans. She pulled one down and flipped through it, her mouth tightening. Handwritten notes filled the margins in her mother's neat, precise script. Calculations, arrows, entire paragraphs of analysis. Olivia slammed it shut and shoved it back into place, her heart pounding. This wasn't the home of a cleaner. This was something else. She turned and noticed a small wooden box on the coffee table. She lifted the lid and froze. Inside were stock certificates, old but carefully preserved, the kind she'd only ever seen in framed displays on her father-in-law's walls. A sound behind her made her jump. Couldn't sleep? Olivia spun around, the box clutched in her hands. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her silhouette calm, her eyes unreadable. Olivia stammered, her cheeks flushing with fury. "I wanted to know the truth." "What are you hiding from me?" Eleanor crossed the room slowly, her steps measured. She took the box gently from her daughter's trembling hands, closed the lid, and set it back on the table. "You're not ready for the truth," she said quietly. Olivia's nails dug into her palms. "Don't treat me like a child. If you've been living a lie, I have a right to know." Eleanor's eyes flickered with something, pain, maybe, or memory. "All right?" she repeated softly. "You called me a pig, Olivia. You laughed while strangers mocked me. You didn't see me as your mother. You saw me as something beneath you. Why should I hand you the truth like a gift?" Olivia's throat tightened, but her pride refused to let the tears fall. "Because I'm your daughter," she whispered hoarsely. Eleanor's gaze softened for a fleeting second, but then hardened again. "Exactly. That's why you'll get the truth only when you're strong enough to hold it." Olivia stormed past her, shoving the door open, her heels echoing down the hallway. The slam rattled the frame. Eleanor sank into her chair, her fingers tracing the wooden box. The shadows in the room seemed to lean closer. Secrets don't last forever. And this one, this secret she had guarded for 2 decades, was beginning to demand daylight. 2 weeks passed, but the memory of that night gnawed at Olivia like a wound that refused to heal. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat without tasting bitterness. Every glance from her husband's family felt like suspicion. Every time Richard Sterling looked at her, she caught the flicker in his eyes, the recognition he hadn't fully explained, the puzzle piece he hadn't yet spoken aloud. Finally, one Friday evening, Richard summoned her and Daniel to his study. The Sterling study was a world of its own, shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, glass cases filled with trophies and awards, the faint scent of aged scotch in the air. Richard sat behind his mahogany desk, his hands steepled, his expression grave. "Sit," he said. His voice carried the weight of command, the kind that had built an empire. Daniel obeyed, tension already tightening his shoulders. Olivia forced herself to glide into the leather chair, her mask of composure firmly in place. Richard studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes sharp. Then he leaned forward. "Your mother," he said slowly, "is not who she pretends to be." Olivia felt her stomach drop, but she kept her face carefully neutral. "Excuse me?" "I know that woman," Richard said, his voice lower now. "Not as a janitor. Not as some cleaning lady. I've seen her face in conference calls. I've read her signature on contracts. I've stood across from her in boardrooms." Daniel frowned. "Dad, that doesn't make sense. Mom-in-law, she's—" He hesitated, clearly struggling for a word that wouldn't offend Olivia. "She lives—" Modestly, Richard's jaw tightened. Modesty doesn't erase power. "Eleanor Hayes is E.J. Bowman." The name fell into the room like a bomb. Olivia's heart lurched into her throat. E.J. Bowman, the mysterious figure whispered about in corporate circles, the elusive investor who appeared out of nowhere to buy failing companies, turn them into giants, and vanish again behind shell corporations. Bowman had become almost myth, the phantom billionaire no one could trace. Daniel's eyes widened. "That's impossible. E.J. Bowman is a man." Richard's lips curled in something between a smile and a grimace. "That's what we all assumed. But I'd stake my life on it. Your mother-in-law is Bowman. She bought Sterling Enterprises out from under me, quietly, efficiently, without mercy." Olivia's hands trembled in her lap, hidden beneath the desk. Her father-in-law's words struck like lightning, each syllable confirming the suspicions that had kept her awake at night. Her mother was the phantom. Her mind raced, replaying every detail. Those finance books, the handwritten notes, the stock certificates, the calm way Eleanor had stared her down. The truth had been there, right in front of her, and she had refused to see it. Daniel turned to his wife, confusion plain on his face. "Olivia, is this true?" "Did you know?" Her throat went dry. The walls seemed to close in. If she admitted she knew nothing, she'd look like a fool. If she admitted she suspected, she'd expose herself as greedy, obsessed, so she did what she always did. She lied. She forced a breath. "I had my suspicions, but she never told me anything directly." Richard leaned back, watching her closely. "Then let me make something clear. If your mother is Bowman, then she is more dangerous than any enemy I've ever faced in business. That woman holds the fate of this family in her hands. Treat her with respect, or you'll lose everything." The silence that followed was unbearable. Olivia's mind screamed with conflicting voices. fury at her mother for hiding this, fear of losing her fragile place in the Sterling dynasty, and an insatiable greed that whispered, "If she's worth millions, maybe billions, then all of it could be yours." Later that night, when she lay in bed beside her husband, Olivia stared at the ceiling, her heart pounding. Daniel's breathing had already deepened into sleep, but she couldn't rest. Her father-in-law was right. Eleanor wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't powerless. She was E.J. Bowman, the phantom who could make or break empires. And Olivia swore to herself with a quiet, burning vow she would find a way to break through her mother's walls. To get inside her secrets, to claim what should have been hers all along, no matter the cost. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her small kitchen, sipping tea from the chipped mug she had used for years. The sound of rain tapping against the window filled the silence. She thought back to the ballroom, the laughter, the humiliation, and Richard Sterling's sudden recognition. She knew what it meant. Her carefully built disguise was starting to crack. For 3 decades, she had hidden behind thrift store clothes and long bus rides, burying E.J. Bowman under Eleanor Hayes, the poor widow. It had protected her from greedy relatives, fake friends, and even her own daughter's disdain. But now, with one slip of recognition, everything was at risk. Her phone buzzed. It wasn't her personal one, the old flip phone her daughter knew about, but the second one, sleek and encrypted. The one tied to her empire. She hesitated before answering. "Ma'am?" Her lawyer's voice came through, calm but urgent. "Sterling is restless. He's asking too many questions. And your daughter has been inquiring too." She hired a private investigator. Eleanor closed her eyes. So Olivia hadn't wasted time. Of course she hadn't. She remembered the look in her daughter's eyes that night, shame quickly swallowed by greed. Eleanor had seen that look 100 times in boardrooms, in desperate CEOs begging for rescue. But to see it in her own child's face was a wound deeper than any insult. "Let her dig," Eleanor finally said. Her voice was steady, cold. "She won't find anything I don't allow her to." The lawyer hesitated. "But if she keeps pressing, then I'll teach her what happens when you push too far." Eleanor cut him off, hanging up. She stared into the rain again, her mind sharp as steel. Olivia thought she could outsmart her. Olivia thought this was about inheritance, about money. She had no idea, because Eleanor wasn't just wealthy. She controlled power webs that stretched across continents. She wasn't merely rich, she was untouchable. But as thunder rolled outside, Eleanor felt something else stir inside her. Something far more dangerous than greed, a mother's bitterness. Her own child had called her a fat pig in front of hundreds of people. No apology, no hesitation, just cruelty. And now that same child was circling like a vulture, hoping to feed on her hidden fortune. Eleanor gripped her mug tighter. If Olivia wanted to play this game, she would learn the hard way. Eleanor had destroyed corporate giants with a single contract. She had crushed egos far larger than her daughter's, but this time, it wasn't business. This time it was personal. The next morning, Olivia sat in her luxury kitchen, staring blankly at her untouched cup of coffee. Her mind hadn't rested all night. Every word her father-in-law had spoken replayed in her head. "Your mother is E.J. Bowman." It sounded insane, like a cruel joke, yet every instinct told her it was true. She thought about the way Mr. Sterling's expression had shifted that night. Shock, then recognition, then something dangerously close to fear. That wasn't a mistake. That wasn't confusion. Her mother had always been strange. But what if all the oddities, the 3 phones, the books about finance, the long nights where she claimed to be cleaning, were never what they seemed? Olivia's nails tapped restlessly against the marble counter. She couldn't rely on her father-in-law's warnings. She needed answers. Real proof. By mid-afternoon, she was standing outside the faded brick building where her mother lived. Rainwater dripped from the cracked awning. She hesitated at the entrance, then pushed through the heavy door. The smell of damp carpet and peeling paint filled her nose. How could a supposed millionaire live here? Olivia climbed the stairs, her heels clicking against the worn wood. She paused outside her mother's apartment door, heart racing. She could hear faint movement inside, kettle whistling, a chair scraping. For a moment, she almost knocked politely. Almost. Instead, she twisted the knob. It was locked, but the old doorframe gave a little when she pushed. She glanced down the hall, empty. Then, with a hard shove, the lock gave way and the door creaked open. Her mother's voice floated from the kitchen. "Olivia?" Olivia froze, then forced a smile as Eleanor stepped into view, wiping her hands on a faded dish towel. Her mother looked exactly as she always had. Plain dress, worn shoes, hair pulled back. But Olivia's eyes weren't on her appearance. They darted around the apartment. Her gaze landed on the desk. Papers stacked neatly. A leather-bound folder tucked just under a newspaper. A faint glow from a second phone charging at the side. Olivia's breath caught. She pasted on her sweetest smile. "Hi, Mom, I just wanted to see you," but inside her pulse thundered. Because she knew that tonight, she wasn't leaving empty-handed. The next morning, Olivia sat in her luxury kitchen, staring blankly at her untouched cup of coffee. Her mind hadn't rested all night. Every word her father-in-law had spoken replayed in her head. "Your mother is E.J. Bowman." It sounded insane, like a cruel joke, yet every instinct told her it was true. She thought about the way Mr. Sterling's expression had shifted that night. Shock, then recognition, then something dangerously close to fear. That wasn't a mistake. That wasn't confusion. Her mother had always been strange. But what if all the oddities, the 3 phones, the books about finance, the long nights where she claimed to be cleaning, were never what they seemed? Olivia's nails tapped restlessly against the marble counter. She couldn't rely on her father-in-law's warnings. She needed answers. Real proof. By mid-afternoon, she was standing outside the faded brick building where her mother lived. Rainwater dripped from the cracked awning. She hesitated at the entrance, then pushed through the heavy door. The smell of damp carpet and peeling paint filled her nose. How could a supposed millionaire live here? Olivia climbed the stairs, her heels clicking against the worn wood. She paused outside her mother's apartment door, heart racing. She could hear faint movement inside, kettle whistling, a chair scraping. For a moment, she almost knocked politely. Almost. Instead, she twisted the knob. It was locked, but the old doorframe gave a little when she pushed. She glanced down the hall, empty. Then, with a hard shove, the lock gave way and the door creaked open. Her mother's voice floated from the kitchen. "Olivia?" Olivia froze, then forced a smile as Eleanor stepped into view, wiping her hands on a faded dish towel. Her mother looked exactly as she always had. Plain dress, worn shoes, hair pulled back. But Olivia's eyes weren't on her appearance. They darted around the apartment. Her gaze landed on the desk. Papers stacked neatly. A leather-bound folder tucked just under a newspaper. A faint glow from a second phone charging at the side. Olivia's breath caught. She pasted on her sweetest smile. "Hi, Mom, I just wanted to see you," but inside her pulse thundered. Because she knew that tonight she wasn't leaving empty-handed. Olivia waited until her mother turned back toward the kitchen. The kettle hissed louder now, steam clouding the tiny window. Eleanor moved slowly, calmly, as if nothing in the world could disturb her evening tea, but Olivia's blood raced hot in her veins. Her eyes fixed on the desk again, the folder, the scraps of paper, the second phone. She drifted across the room, her heels muffled by the old rug. Her fingers trembled as she slid the newspaper aside and pulled the folder into her lap. She opened it quickly, her breath shallow. Inside were bank receipts, a few typed contracts, and what looked like correspondence printed out from email. One slip caught her eye immediately. Wire transfer confirmation. $3,500,000. Recipient. Beaumont Holdings International. Olivia's heart lurched. Her eyes devoured the numbers, the corporate seal, the signature at the bottom. It looked real. Too real. She dug deeper, pulling out another paper. A photocopy of a shareholder's certificate, E.J. Bowman, 72% stakeholder. Her pulse thundered. She wanted to scream, to laugh, to cry all at once. Her mother wasn't just involved, she was Bowman. It was here, right in her hands. Find what you were looking for? The voice was quiet but sharp as a knife. Olivia flinched. Her mother stood in the doorway, arms folded, eyes steady. Steam curled from the forgotten kettle behind her. Olivia tried to gather herself, clutching the folder tighter. I dropped something. Eleanor stepped closer, her gaze never leaving her daughter's face. Don't lie. You've been waiting your whole life to see what I hide. And now you think you've found it. Olivia swallowed, her throat dry. So it's true. You are Bowman. All this time you let me believe you were nothing. You let me despise you. Her voice cracked. Why? Her mother's face remained calm, unreadable. She crossed the room slowly, stopping just inches away. She took the papers gently from Olivia's shaking hands, stacked them neatly, and slid them back into the folder. Then she leaned in, her voice low enough to feel like a secret. Sometimes, Olivia, the most dangerous thing you can give a greedy person is hope. And with that, she closed the folder with a snap that echoed in the silence. Olivia's chest heaved as she stared at the folder her mother had just snapped shut. The sound of that single click echoed through her bones. She wanted to snatch it back, to tear it open and scream until Eleanor admitted the truth, but the calm in her mother's eyes froze her. That calm wasn't the meekness of a poor widow. It wasn't the weariness of a cleaner. It was the calm of someone who owned the room, who could strip a person down to nothing with a single glance. I don't understand, Olivia whispered, her voice shaking despite the anger boiling in her chest. You had all this, and you let me grow up in secondhand clothes? You let me struggle, embarrassed every time I had to tell people where I came from. Why? Why would you do that to me? Eleanor turned away, reaching to switch off the kettle. Her voice floated back, even and steady. Because you never struggled, Olivia. Not really. Struggle builds humility. Struggle teaches you to see people as human. But you... She set the kettle down, her movement slow, deliberate. You learned entitlement instead. Olivia's face burned. Entitlement? I fought for everything I have. No. Eleanor's eyes met hers again, sharper this time. You clawed your way into a family with a sterling name, thinking it would make you more than you are. You laughed at your own blood when she came to celebrate you. You thought wealth was something to marry into, to wear like a crown. You never once considered it could be something you built. The words sank like poison into Olivia's skin. She hated the way her stomach twisted, the way her throat tightened. Because somewhere deep inside she knew her mother was right. But pride wouldn't let her admit it. You're lying, she hissed, her fists clenched at her sides. You've always been jealous. You never wanted me to have a better life than you. That's why you hid it. That's why you're keeping it all for yourself. A thin smile tugged at the corner of Eleanor's mouth. Not amusement, but pity. You think this is about money? She shook her head. Money is nothing, Olivia. It's a tool, not a prize, and you don't even know how to hold it. Olivia's heart pounded. Rage built inside her chest like fire threatening to explode. If you think you can keep this from me, she spat, you're wrong. I'll find out everything. And when I do, you won't be able to stop me. Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply stepped forward, so close Olivia could see the calm steel in her mother's gaze. Careful, Olivia, she said softly, almost tenderly. You're playing a game you don't even know the rules to, and people who play games blind get burned. For the first time, Olivia had no words. She stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door so hard the frame shuddered. Eleanor stood in the silence that followed, her hand resting on the folder. Her expression shifted, just for a flicker, from steel to sorrow. Then, just as quickly, the mask returned. She knew now. The time for hiding was nearly over. Olivia drove back to the Sterling estate with her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The rain smeared the windshield, blurring the road, but she barely noticed. Her mother's words rang in her ears like a curse. "You don't even know how to hold it." By the time she arrived, her rage had hardened into something colder, sharper. She wasn't going to wait for her mother to hand her the truth. She was going to take it. Inside the mansion, Richard Sterling was in his study, reviewing reports by the firelight. The room smelled faintly of leather and smoke, a place built for secrets. Olivia entered without knocking, her eyes blazing. "We need to talk," she said. Richard looked up, his sharp gaze taking her in. "About your mother?" "Yes," she hissed, stepping closer. "She's hiding everything from me. But you know, don't you? You've suspected it all along. Tell me what you know." Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "What I know," he said slowly, "is that your mother is far more powerful than you realize. And if you're wise, you'll tread carefully." Olivia's jaw clenched. "Careful? She humiliated me. She's kept me in the dark my whole life while she sat on billions. And you expect me to be careful?" Richard's eyes narrowed. "Do you want the truth, or do you want revenge?" Olivia blinked, her breath catching. "Both." For the first time, Richard's lips curved into a smile, cold, calculating. He rose from his chair and poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handing one to her. "Then perhaps," he said, "we can help each other." Olivia's pulse quickened as she took the glass. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. With Richard Sterling at her side, she could finally break through Eleanor's walls. But in her mother's apartment across town, Eleanor was already moving her pieces across the board. She sat at the small desk, the folder still unopened beside her, and tapped out a message on the encrypted phone. A list of names, instructions written with surgical precision. Her empire stirred like a sleeping beast at her command. When she set the phone down, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. Her daughter was aligning herself with Richard Sterling, an old adversary Eleanor had outmaneuvered once before. She had expected it, almost welcomed it, because Eleanor wasn't afraid of their alliance. She was waiting for it, and when the moment came, when Olivia and Richard thought they had her cornered, Eleanor Hayes would show them both what happened when you tried to play a queen off the board. The kettle whistled again, steam curling into the dim light. Eleanor poured herself a cup of tea, her expression calm, almost serene. But behind her eyes, the storm was already gathering. Richard poured a second glass of whiskey and slid it across the polished mahogany desk toward Olivia. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from the thrill of finally being taken seriously. Richard Sterling was a man of power, a man who commanded entire industries, and now he was treating her as an equal. Or at least, that's what she told herself. Richard studied her over the rim of his glass. "You want answers. So do I. Your mother has been a ghost in the business world for years, moving silently, never showing her face. If she truly is Bowman, she has her hands in nearly every major industry. That makes her more dangerous than anyone I've ever competed against." Olivia leaned forward, eyes glittering. "Then we bring her down, together. She's old, she's weak. She can't hold on to it forever. We'll take everything she has." Richard's lips curved into a faint smile. "Careful, my dear. That kind of talk will make me wonder whether you're dangerous too." "I'm your family now," Olivia said firmly. "And I won't let her hold this over me any longer." Richard didn't respond right away. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the firelight flicker across its surface. Finally, he said, "Very well. But understand this, if we make a move against her, there is no turning back. Bowman has crushed giants with the stroke of a pen. If we fail, it won't just be embarrassment we face. It will be ruin." Olivia's heart hammered. She thought of the laughter at her wedding, the whispers at the country club. The way people looked at her now with curiosity instead of envy. She thought of her mother's cool, pitying smile. "I don't care," she whispered. "She humiliated me. She owes me. And I'll make sure she pays." Richard nodded slowly. "Then here is what we'll do. We'll lure her out. Bowman hides in shadows, but Eleanor Hayes has a weakness: family. If we set the right trap, she'll walk into it. And when she does, her empire will be ours." Olivia felt a surge of triumph course through her veins. At last, she had an ally who understood. At last, she had a plan. But across town, Eleanor was already moving her own pieces. In the dim light of her apartment, she sat at her desk, her encrypted phone buzzing with confirmations. Shell corporations shifting, assets moving quietly offshore, new contracts drafted and signed. She had built her empire on secrecy and foresight, and she had seen this day coming years ago. Her daughter's betrayal was painful, yes, but predictable. Eleanor closed the folder and set it aside, then lit a single candle on the table. The flame flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. She whispered to herself, almost like a vow, "They think they're hunting me. Let them come. The day they strike is the day they'll learn. Queens don't fall. They watch the pawns burn." And with that, she lifted her cup of tea to her lips, the faintest smile curving her mouth. The storm was coming. They set the trap like hunters who think themselves clever. Richard arranged a private dinner at the Sterling Club, an oak-paneled dining room reserved for the family's most delicate conversations. Olivia smiled as she adjusted her cuff, practiced calm leaking from her like perfume. Daniel hovered by the doorway, uneasy but loyal. There were 2 extra places set, plates unsubtle and heavy, the bottles of wine quiet and ready. The maitre d' had been told it was a reconciliation dinner, and the room smelled of roasted lamb and old money. Richard called it a business dinner to keep things formal. To Olivia, it was a staging, a place to lure Eleanor into a conversation under the pretense of civility, and then force her hand. If Eleanor, could be pinned by the right pressure, the right question, the right show of family outrage, she thought they would finally see her for what she was, a flimsy, aging pretender who had been lucky once and would not be lucky again. Eleanor accepted the invitation because her voice, calm, polite, would make it impossible not to. "Family matters," she had said, folding a napkin into her bag, "are best handled face to face." She arrived at the club a little late, politely late, the way someone who always controlled attention arrived. Not because she wanted it, but because she knew how to take it. Her maroon dress was plain but clean, her hair pulled back. She carried the little gold box, the one Olivia had tried to steal back into her hands weeks before, as if it were a talisman. Cameras did not follow her. The club was private. No one outside those oak doors would know tonight's content. That was the point. They sat. Wine was poured. Small talk felt brittle. Richard spoke first, clipped and careful, as if opening a file. "Eleanor," he said, leaning forward, "we need to talk about the recent, investments. About your involvement with Sterling Enterprises." His eyes were flat as steel. "We want clarity." Olivia watched from the corner of her mouth, anticipating the ripple that would come when the accusation landed. She could feel her pulse buzzing like an engine in the silence between Richard's question and Eleanor's answer. Eleanor folded her napkin, set it aside, and looked at Richard as though she were folding a troublesome piece of paper. "Clarity," she echoed softly. "You want clarity. Of course. Did you acquire Stake X through shell companies?" Richard's tone sharpened. "Did you orchestrate the acquisition without notifying the family? Did you wire funds, influence the board, and then vanish?" Eleanor looked at Olivia then, and there was no tremor in her voice. "Yes," she said simply. "I did what needed to be done. I bought what was failing, and I saved the jobs inside it. I paid what it required. I kept it quiet because I didn't want to invite the vultures." A ripple passed through the table. Surprise, annoyance, a hint of relief. Richard's jaw tightened. He was expecting shock, maybe a denial, perhaps legal posturing. He was not expecting gratitude dressed as truth, but the real movement came next. Eleanor leaned forward and tapped the small leather folder that had been with her all evening. She opened it, and with the same calm clarity she used to read balance sheets in the dark, she began to speak about Sterling Enterprises, not as an accusation, but as a brief, clear lecture about solvency and leadership. "You've bled the company dry over vanity projects," she said. "Executive bonuses while factories stagnated. Short-term gains for long-term collapse. I saw the numbers, Mr. Sterling. I saw the unpaid invoices and the missed audits. Someone needed to make a choice. Close the doors and let men go without pay, or pay a price now to keep the lights on. I chose the latter." She spoke with facts, dates, contract clauses, signatures. She named auditors whose reports she'd quietly paid for, lawyers who had advised forced restructures, the exact amount she had transferred to bridge payroll during the crunch. It was precise and surgical. Each sentence landed like a scalpel on the tablecloth. Olivia had expected a meltdown. Instead, the room shifted to a different currency: shame. Richard's face went pallid. He recognized the truth of what she read, because, privately, he had been keeping the crisis ledger in his head for months. "You came into my house and I laughed at you," Richard said finally, voice brittle. "Because I was ashamed to admit that I had been failing at what I built." Eleanor's gaze softened for a fraction of a beat. "And you are not the first to be ashamed," she replied. "But shame is a terrible counselor." Then Eleanor did something unexpected. She folded up the folder, placed it in the middle of the table, and said very quietly, "I could take control of this company entirely tomorrow. I have the legal instruments to do so. But I did not come to crush a family. I came because I value the people who work in those factories. Their livelihoods matter more than any slight you choose to make at a dinner." Her voice drifted through the oak like a bell. Here was the pivot. She made the moral choice public before they could make it private. She framed herself not as the greedy outsider who had stolen money, but as the reluctant savior who had spent her fortune to prevent ruin. Olivia felt something crack inside her. The triumphant plan she'd rehearsed, that moment where her mother would be unmasked, sorry, and she would be swept into favor, crumbled like a paper crown. Richard, sensing the crowd's tilt toward pity at the idea of jobs saved, tried to regain control. "If that's true, then why not explain it?" he demanded. "Why the secrecy?" "Because the secrecy kept the company alive," Eleanor said. "Because public knowledge would have allowed predators to feast. Because I did not wish to make this a spectacle. I did not ask for a parade. It was a hard truth. It complicated the narrative. It made the family look petty next to the scale of the decision she'd made." Olivia felt anger and the first prickling of shame. Her rehearsed lines on greed sounded suddenly small. But she wasn't done. She leaned forward, voice low and fierce. "So you saved them, did you? You did all of this and then let me humiliate me in front of people I care about? You let me believe I was ashamed of you." Eleanor met her glare with a patient, terrible calm. "You called me names while others laughed. You could have asked a single question. You chose performance instead. You made that choice in front of people who then learned a lesson about how easily cruelty becomes entertainment." The room tightened. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, aware now of the cost of his family's arrogance. He reached for Olivia's hand beneath the table, a small, warm anchor. Richard's mouth opened and closed. He had expected a frail apology, a stumble. He had not expected Eleanor to turn the attack into a lesson about dignity. Then, in the space of a single breath, Eleanor rose. The small gold box was in her hand. She placed it squarely on the table so everyone could see it. The pearls inside glinted in the soft light, modest but elegant. "These are pearls my husband meant to give Olivia on her wedding day," she said, addressing Olivia like a final sentence. "I saved them so he could keep his promise. You will have them, Olivia, if you can apologize to the people you hurt. Not just to me, to the staff, to those you humiliated for entertainment. Apologize publicly with humility. If you do that, we shall step forward together to repair what was harmed." The silence that followed was hot and heavy. Olivia's breath came fast. She wanted to say no, to demand payment instead of dignity, to snatch the pearls and call it a day. But the fork in front of her was illuminated with a clarity she hadn't expected. One path was easy and corrosive. The other was hard and, perhaps, restoring. Richard opened his mouth to speak, to bargain, to salvage whatever authority he could. Instead, he found himself nodding, slowly, almost involuntarily, toward Eleanor's words. The idea of a public reconciliation, of the family being seen to do the right thing, had its own value. At the table, even Daniel looked as if he'd been given a map he'd been too proud to ask for. He gripped Olivia's hand, a plea in that motion. Olivia's eyes burned. The room waited. In that breath, she made a choice. Not clean, not purely noble, but a choice. She rose, voice trembling, and walked to the small service door where the staff were gathered, wiping plates and folding napkins. Her apology was awkward and half-broken, but it was real. She called names. She swallowed pride. She said the words everyone in that room had been waiting to hear. The staff were stunned. Some accepted it with flat faces. Others, surprised and wary, offered a cautious smile. For Eleanor, the apology mattered more as a seed than as a cosmetic gesture. She let the moment breathe, then returned to the table. They drank slowly after that. The atmosphere was altered, not cured, but shifted toward a new balance. Olivia had been exposed to what true humility looked like. Richard had been confronted with the moral cost of corporate image. Daniel had found an axis of compassion between his wife and his father. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city glittered with indifferent light. Eleanor left the Sterling Club that night with nothing announced. No press, no spectacle, but within certain private channels, the story had already taken a different life. Not of bones of scandal, but of salvage, of a woman who had chosen people over pride. On the drive home, Olivia stared out the window. The pairs of streetlights smudged across the glass, and for the first time in months, she felt the small weight of contrition settle in her chest like an honest coin. It wouldn't erase everything, and money could still do what money does, but the rules of the game had changed. She had walked into a trap and come out with a lesson. Whether she would be better for it, or only more clever, remained to be seen. The night was heavy with silence when Eleanor finally returned to her apartment. She placed the little gold box on the table, its pearls glowing faintly in the lamplight. For years she had lived in shadows, letting people think she was nothing, letting her own daughter despise her. Tonight, the curtain had been pulled back. A knock echoed on the door. When she opened it, Olivia stood there, her face pale, mascara streaked from tears she had tried to hide. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited, her heels clicking nervously against the floor. For once, there was no venom in her voice. "Only exhaustion. Why?" she whispered. "Why didn't you tell me who you were? Why let me treat you that way?" Eleanor's eyes softened. She reached for the pearls, turning them gently in her hands. "Because, Olivia, money doesn't make people kinder. It only shows who they really are. I wanted you to learn to see people without knowing their worth on paper." "But you never did." Olivia's lips trembled. She looked at her mother, really looked, as if for the first time. The woman she had mocked, dismissed, hated, was the one who had carried her, fed her, sacrificed everything quietly, and still thought of her enough to save the pearls for her wedding day. Tears welled in her eyes. She sank into the chair, her voice breaking. "I don't deserve them. Or you." Eleanor placed the pearls into her daughter's shaking hands anyway. "You don't give love because someone deserves it. You give it because it's the only thing that outlasts everything else." Olivia bowed her head, silent sobs shaking her shoulders. For the first time, she felt small, not because of shame, but because of the weight of truth. Eleanor stood by the window, watching the city lights shimmer in the distance. She had hidden her power for decades, survived ridicule, betrayal, even her own child's cruelty. And still she remained unbroken, because wealth was not her legacy. Her legacy was the lesson she had finally given her daughter. that dignity. Compassion and humility were worth more than millions. As Olivia wept quietly behind her, Eleanor let out a long breath and whispered to herself, almost like a prayer, "Queens don't fall. They rise." And with that, the story of the fat pig ended not in humiliation, but in victory, silent, unshakable, and eternal.